Hello everybody and welcome to the Turning Point. McLaren made history, Mercedes ends an era, and Bottas shared his secrets. That's right, the 2024 Formula 1 season came to a close this weekend in Abu Dhabi, and it was a banging race, quite literally, for some of the drivers out there on Sunday. Just to quickly remind you of the race result, Lando Norris came home in first place, another win for the McLaren car, securing that Constructors' Championship. Sainz and Leclerc joined him on the podium, a double podium for Ferrari, and a lovely kind of celebratory podium for Carlos Sainz as he moves over to Williams next year. Lewis Hamilton was just behind him, fourth place. His teammate George Russell tried his best, in air quotes, to keep Lewis Hamilton behind, but ended up in fifth place just behind him. Our four-time world champion Max Verstappen came home in sixth place. And then it all got a little bit crazy. Pierre Gasly just doing what he does at the end of the season, apparently, coming home in seventh place. Nico Hülkenberg came home in eighth place, not quite able to get Haas that Constructors' Championship, sixth place. Then Fernando Alonso scored points in ninth, and Piastri scored points, but in 10th. And he should have been way, way higher in the standings had it not been for that first lap calamity, which we'll delve into a little bit later. Then behind that, just outside the points, Albon, Tsunoda, Joe, Stroll, Doohan and Magnussen all finished the race, with Lawson, Bottas, Colapinto and Perez all DNFing for a multitude of different reasons throughout the 58 laps of the Yas Marina circuit. It really was a weird end to the season. I thought it was going to be a lot more somber. I thought a lot more drivers would be sort of chilled out because they're either moving on to different things or moving to other teams, so they wouldn't want to put too many people's noses out. But actually, a lot of the drivers just decided this was their final opportunity to prove something, and they really went for it. In terms of the drivers' standings, how it looks at the end of the season, with Jack Doohan joining the crew, 24 drivers we've seen across the 24 races this season. And I like this point in the year because we can start to see those gaps between drivers. Of course, Max Verstappen winning the championship, but Sergio Perez all the way down in 8th place, a 285-point gap between the two of them. And you can understand why now Red Bull are maybe questioning Sergio Perez's performances a little bit more than they maybe should have been throughout the season. He's got away with quite a few disastrous races, Sergio Perez. This one included, possibly, if he does manage to keep that seat for the 2025 campaign. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, second and fourth place overall. I think Charles Leclerc did deserve that third place. I thought it was going to be closer, to be honest, between Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri in third place. There was a point just after Monza, I was talking about those two being very in form, and it was Azerbaijan as well. We got to see them side by side for first and second place in back-to-back races, and I thought it was going to be a real stretch for either one of those to pick up that third place position, but Charles Leclerc absolutely ran away with it, and Oscar Piastri had a few off races to end the year, but I don't think that will put him out too much. Winning that Constructors' Championship was the main thing that McLaren had in mind, and they got that done. Then the Ferrari 2, talking about Charles Leclerc finishing in third, Carlos Sainz finishing in fifth. Again, quite a gap between the two of them, 66 points in the end between the two Ferrari drivers. But if you look at some of the other points gaps, it's not too bad. Obviously, less than the gap between Norris and Piastri, much less than the gap between Verstappen and Perez. And then the two Mercedes drivers kind of side by side, in fourth place in the constructor standings and in sixth place and seventh place in the driver standings. George Russell just winning out that battle. Again, another battle that I thought would be to and fro throughout the final part of the season. But Lewis Hamilton, I think, just happy to see the back of that Mercedes car, even if he did have a pretty good Abu Dhabi weekend. Well, I say weekend. He had a pretty good Abu Dhabi race. Qualifying was mental, but that's just very Lewis Hamilton at the moment, isn't it? He can't have everything. Aston Martin then behind that. Look at Fernando Alonso finishing best of the rest on 70 points. He basically guaranteed that within the first 5-6 races of the season, just put himself a mile ahead of the rest of the midfield when that Aston Martin was comparable in pace to the Mercedes car at the beginning of the year. And as it tailed off, the points deteriorated for Fernando a little bit, but he still managed to have a few points finishes here and there just to guarantee it. Yeah, Gasly, though, jumps Hülkenberg into 10th place. That top 10 finish, very, very close between the two of them. If you had to say which of the two drivers was better throughout the entire year, I think Nico Hülkenberg definitely wins that. But Pierre Gasly picking up those podium places, or the podium place in Brazil, but also some top 5 finishes, some top 7 finishes. Just a really, really solid end to the season for Pierre Gasly, and something that we should be very excited to see what he can do next year if Alpine can move forwards. Never a guarantee with the Alpine team, is it? Haas, Nico Hülkenberg just behind that, also just behind in the Constructors' Championship as well. We'll delve into what went wrong for them over the course of this weekend and the fact that actually it could have been very, very different and Alpine could have had egg on their face because they got rid of Esteban Ocon with 1 race left to go. And Esteban Ocon is much more likely to get you points than Jack Doohan, but they just about held on. Yuki Tsunoda, just behind that in 12th place. Again, I think has been one of the better midfield drivers. Has he been as good as Nico Hülkenberg? I don't think so. He's definitely been in that realm, and I can sort of appreciate that Yuki Tsunoda is in about the right spot in the Drivers' Championship at the end of the year for what I'm thinking. You know, comfortably beating out Daniel Ricciardo. I know he had an extra 6 Grand Prix, but even if you add Daniel Ricciardo's 12 points and Liam Lawson's 4 points together, they're still quite far adrift, 14 points adrift of Yuki Tsunoda's 30 points for the season. Williams, Albon, Colapinto adding to their Constructors' Championship, but they just kind of fell away as soon as it looked like they might enter the fight, and it was a little bit of a stretch to enter that fight for 6th place. They got leapfrogged by Alpine, as many different teams did, and then also just couldn't quite get it together. I think Alex Albon in particular will be so happy that the season has ended. Probably not, because he's got Carlos Sainz coming in beside him next season. It's going to be a real test of Alex Albon, but he's going to be quite happy that the season is just done and dusted, because he went through a 4, 5, 6 race stint at the end there that was absolutely appalling. And then Sauber at the bottom of the Constructors' Championship. Joe getting their 4 points on the board, 20th place for him in a 20-driver championship. Valtteri Bottas finishes 22nd in a 20-driver championship. And then we've got Logan Sargent, Jack Doohan at the bottom there. No points for them as well. But behind Valtteri Bottas, because Bottas did manage an 11th place finish, Sargent managed a 12th place finish in Silverstone, and Jack Doohan obviously only 1 race to his name, where he finished in 15th place in Abu Dhabi. And that, as I say, leads us to the constructor standings. Just to summarize all of that, McLaren at the top. They win the first Constructors' Championship they've had since 1998. And I think they are the deserving winners, just about. There's a couple of races where Ferrari will really kick themselves over the course of the season. I think Ferrari, actually, looking at the season as a whole, and I know that McLaren had, especially since Miami, maybe had the most consistent car, I want to say. It's really difficult to judge the cars over the course of the entire year because there's so many ebbs and flows throughout this season. I would say the McLaren car has been the best suited to the majority of tracks. I think it's been less peaky than the other cars. Mercedes, super peaky throughout the year. I think they absolutely categorized that and what I'm talking about when I'm talking about peaky performances. The fact that they had one race where they were absolutely flying, won it by a mile. You look at Las Vegas or somewhere like Spa as well, where they completely dominated it. And then they had races where they were the 6th or 7th fastest car. And it was like, what on earth is happening at Mercedes? They had a super peaky performance. Red Bull just had a split performance in terms of the 2 drivers inside the car. As we talked about with the distance between the 2 of them in the driver's standings, I think Ferrari and McLaren had the best driver pairings, and they had the most consistent car. I think Ferrari's car was probably quicker in more of the race. It's very close. It's very close. I want to say that the Ferrari car, just because it was a little bit better at the beginning of the season, but it did drop off dramatically in the middle of the season, actually. And Charles Leclerc had a bit of a sort of 4-5 race stint around Canada that was pretty atrocious after he won that Monaco Grand Prix. We all thought, oh, okay, the curse has moved from Monaco onto the rest of Charles Leclerc's season. But I do think the standings doesn't lie, unless you're Alpine. That is a lie. That is an absolute lie when it comes to 6th place. They were not the 6th fastest team by any stretch of the imagination across the entire 24 races. But, you know, you can sneak in there. A double podium finish in Brazil in the absolute chaos that is always the Interlagos Grand Prix. sneak into 6th place, ruin Haas's weekend, and I do feel a little bit sad for Haas, but we'll delve into that a little bit more as we go through the race itself, because we do have to talk about the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, not just the drivers and where they came in various positions. Let's talk about McLaren winning that Constructors' Championship. As I said, the first championship since 1998. The McLaren car has been much improved. We've seen a ridiculous turn of form from the beginning of 2023, where they were by far the slowest car, and we were looking at Oscar Piastri coming into a team that was atrocious. I remember his first 10 races in McLaren, and he barely got anywhere near the points. And it was like, oh my God, this could be a real disaster from Oscar Piastri. Obviously, he was under a lot of pressure because he'd switched over from Alpine without the Alpine team wanting him to make that switch. And I think it's finally been justified, hasn't it? They much improved last season, then improved again this season. And now, as I say, are probably the most consistent across all venues. I don't think they're the fastest car every single Grand Prix, but they don't have as bigger peaks and troughs as some of the other teams on the Formula One grid. They have that middle line performance where they can just about be as good as they need to be in every single Grand Prix, and that bodes really well, obviously moving into them later on. I think there was a good middle portion of the season where we thought this was absolutely guaranteed, but then Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari kept chipping in with wins after the summer break, and it did change the complexion of the Constructors' Championship a little bit, and did put a bit of pressure on the McLaren team. I was worried they were going to fold. We've seen that the pressure of the Drivers' Championship really got to them at points. They made a few strategy errors and pit stop errors, and just little things throughout the season that a championship dominant team wouldn't quite make. And I thought that the Constructors' Championship might also just be that little bit too much pressure for this McLaren team at the time, but they proved me wrong. They were very, very good, and they were very, very good at the end of the season and picked up just the amount of points that they needed to, even in tracks where it didn't quite go well. And I think they can thank Lando Norris a little bit for that. I feel bad for Oscar Piastri in this because Oscar Piastri has been, of the two, the more generally consistent. I mean, he finished every single lap of every single race, did Oscar Piastri. And technically, the McLaren team didn't have any DNFs this season. I know that Austria, I even looked into it and I was like, hang on, Lando Norris didn't take the checkered flag, but apparently he was put in as a +7 laps. I don't know how many laps you have to be behind to not be categorized as a finisher, but apparently you can finish 7 laps behind the winner, and you can be categorized as still finishing that Grand Prix. So technically, the McLaren team finished every race, not necessarily every lap of every race. But Oscar Piastri did do that. He finished every single lap of every single Grand Prix, which has to be applauded. But this time around, the plaudits did go to Lando Norris. I mean, it wasn't the hardest win that he's had this season. He didn't really have to fight for it too much, nor was it the easiest win. You look at the dominance that he had in Singapore, for example, and it was somewhere in between the two. I think he was nearing more so Singapore, where he and Carlos Sainz just disappeared off into the distance. They had a pit stop advantage to third place Charles Leclerc by the end of the Grand Prix. Could have comfortably come in and pit both of them for another set of tyres and still been first and second place. And there was real pressure on him, as I say, especially once he sees Oscar Piastri spin behind him. There is a huge amount of pressure for Lando Norris to deliver that victory, because if we do flip the two drivers and Carlos Sainz does manage to just sneak in front of Lando Norris for a victory, that's a 14-point swing, and that would put Ferrari on the top of the Constructors' Championship. So Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc did everything that they possibly could to put as much pressure on Lando Norris as possible inside of the circumstances, but he did really, really well. And I do think, when it came to the fact that Lando Norris has had quite a lot of criticism this year, I don't really know how I want to phrase this, because I do think some of it has been unjust. When we're talking about Lando Norris entering the Drivers' Championship battle, I think for the majority of Formula One fans, we kind of knew that was never, in the reality of things, that was going to happen. I think we all hoped it. we all wanted Max Verstappen to have a DNF somewhere, or, well, unless you're a Red Bull or Max Verstappen fan, but the general fan that wanted a title battle just to play out, we were hoping for a little bit of a miracle, right? We were hoping for a Max Verstappen DNF, which just doesn't really happen. I think there's an insane stat that Max Verstappen hasn't finished outside of the top 10 since 2016. And that obviously doesn't include DNFs and things like Australia. Like, he didn't actually finish the Grand Prix. But if he finishes the Grand Prix, he finishes inside of the top 10, undoubtedly. So we were really praying for something special if Lando Norris was ever going to catch Max Verstappen. And I think a lot of the pressure and a lot of the negativity was directed more so at Lando Norris than, I think, the McLaren team, who made more mistakes than Lando Norris. Like, there were so many things about Lando's starts not being good enough, or Lando missing out on wins from pole position and things like that, where I think actually more points were dropped by the McLaren team when it came to the pit stop in Canada that could have gone a bit better, the pit stop in Silverstone where they put the wrong tyres on the car, in my opinion, things in Hungary where they gave Oscar Piastri the victory, and I think that at the time was justified. But again, you can see that as a 7-point swing, and that was determined by the McLaren team and not Lando Norris. So Lando, I think, got some unjust criticism throughout the season, but did really, really well here and kind of put his critics down a little bit by being really consistent, showing that he's got the determination, showing that he's got the characteristics to perform under that pressure and to drag his team to a Constructors' Championship at the end of the season when it all really mattered. Also, he's matched Max Verstappen for pole positions, obviously got his first race win on the board this season. There is a lot of things that Lando Norris has been able to learn from this year. And as he said, next year is going to be his year as well. And I think next year is the real chance for Lando Norris to show what he's actually got. I think this year was sort of hope and pray when it came to the summer break, and we started to see those gaps in the points, and we started to try and add up, oh, how much can Max Verstappen score here, there, and wherever. Next year is an actual, okay, McLaren now need to not turn up 6 races into the season. They need to turn up right at the first race in Bahrain. And then they need to continue on for the entire year and show that dominance and show those characteristics that they showed for 2/3 of the year throughout the entirety of it. Let's talk about Piastri. Obviously, there wasn't much to say about Oscar. I think Oscar just doing his thing wasn't ideal, being smashed into by Max Verstappen, but I also don't think there was too much that he could have done. Smashing into the back of Franco Colapinto was an interesting way to get himself back into the race. Obviously caught up to the back of the pack after the safety car, then made it a little bit harder for himself. As I say, smashing into the back of Franco Colapinto, not ideal. I think maybe that was the pressure getting to him a touch. It seemed like such an uncharacteristic mistake for a driver that, as I say, has literally finished every lap of every Grand Prix just to bump into the back of somebody. A little bit strange, but completely bailed out by Lando Norris. Did manage to get up into the point scoring places. Obviously got that singular point for the team, rounding 25 up to 26. But if they hadn't won the Constructors' Championship, the team probably wouldn't be looking at Oscar Piastri too fondly for the next couple of weekends or so. I think it was interesting that Andrea Stella did talk about Oscar Piastri's potential for next year in and amongst the celebrations, and talked about the fact that if Lando Norris does have, and the McLaren team can deliver him a car that is capable of winning championships, shouldn't count out Oscar Piastri from also being in the mix. Is Oscar Piastri quite there? I think the deficit to Lando Norris in qualifying has become a little bit more obvious over the course of the season. It was one thing that in 2023, I was really concerned about Oscar Piastri's longevity on the tyres and the fact that he wasn't able to quite hold on to, especially like the medium compound tyres, for those longer stints inside of the race. And it was actually his qualifying pace and his one-lap pace that really did shine. Thing is slightly turned a little bit as the season has progressed, and that may be to do with the balance of the car that he needs for the longevity of the tires and things along those lines. We don't know how much detail the team obviously don't give up that much detail about their drivers inside and out, But I do think he's lost just a little bit of pace in qualifying generally to Lando Norris. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And that will come into play. And that's something that, again, if he can get that kind of pace from 2023, those electric moments that we saw from him, and they were moments like that throughout this season as well. Monaco, he was absolutely brilliant. He just missed out on that pole position to Charles Leclerc, and it was one of Charles Leclerc's best laps that he's done. So Oscar Piastri is certainly in the title battle if the McLaren car is by far and away the best. I think if it comes down to McLaren versus Ferrari or McLaren versus Red Bull, I think Lando Norris is just slightly better suited to be the driver that will take the fight to that other team. And say like next year, it's Lando Norris finishing P1 or P2 and Charles Leclerc either way around. Or Lewis Hamilton, I forgot. Lewis Hamilton going to Ferrari could also be in that mix. But say it's McLaren and Ferrari battling, I think it will end up being Lando over Oscar. If it's the McLarens battling and, it's 1-2 constantly and we have a little bit of a Lewis Hamilton, Nico Rosberg situation on our hands, I think Oscar Piastri has shown that he's got the consistency to just put himself right up there and put himself in that mix for the Drivers' Championship for the foreseeable future. And I think he will really shine in 2025. That third year in Formula One is usually, when you see it, quite a glow up for a lot of the drivers. It's really hard to get a third year in Formula One, don't get me wrong, but when drivers do tend to get to that third season, and this might just be me, some sort of looking at the 5-6 years that I've really delved into understanding and seeing Formula One from a different perspective, but usually it's that third year turning point where I see that, oh, okay, they've really stepped up. You've got that first year where you're learning everything, second year where you really settle in, and third year where you almost feel like you're part of the grid now, right? If you're in your third year, you've made it that far, you've shown that you're good enough to get a third season in Formula One, you kind of got that air of confidence about you, and I think we'll see that more so from Oscar Piastri next year. To talk about their championship rivals in Ferrari, as much as Charles Leclerc really wanted it to happen, he looked absolutely gutted after the race, considering he'd driven from P19 to P3 and had put in one of the most insane performances. Like the fact that he got that Q2 lap deletion, the fact that he also had to take a 10-place grid penalty for changing his ERS, and he kind of took all of that in his stride. One of the best opening couple of laps you will ever see. He went from P19 to P8 in a couple of laps. It was insane to see. And yes, of course, there are a few collisions in front of him. There are a few drivers taking each other out. But the moves that he made, just watch that onboard. Just watch that onboard. Don't listen to me describe it. Go and watch the onboard of Charles Leclerc's first couple of laps in that Ferrari. And it is almost like the cars around him are standing still. It is insane. Like the moves that he is able to make inside of that Ferrari car, again, just shows you the pace that is really underlying there. Yes, the ultimate performance of the Ferrari car wasn't quite there to win the Constructors' Championship, but they were the second quickest car once again. And I think they've got a lot of positives that they can take into next year. I don't think there's too much to talk about in terms of Charles Leclerc. I think he's had a wonderful season once again. I think he's again shown that he is ready to win a championship. He's always going to be in that conversation. Will it be next year finally that Ferrari can deliver him a car that is consistent across the whole season? Because as I say, there was that little dip in the middle of the year. Had that not been there, and Charles Leclerc, and just a little bit earlier, I think Monza was just a touch too late for that Ferrari car to become the quickest, or it was kind of in there with the McLaren as the quickest car throughout. If Charles Leclerc had managed to win those few races that Mercedes were like dominant in, say Mercedes didn't turn up in Silverstone or in Spa, and that was replaced, it's easy to say now, but Charles Leclerc would have been right inside of that title battle. And there's been discussion actually about whether Charles Leclerc would have been closer or further away to Max Verstappen inside of a McLaren car. Even as a McLaren fan, even as a huge Lando Norris fan, I think just Charles Leclerc's got that experience of being right up the front end of the grid that little bit more so than Lando Norris. And I think Charles Leclerc probably would have been closer to Max Verstappen at the end of the year had he been in a McLaren car. But of course, it's impossible to say properly. I just think in terms of the experience that they've got and the way that Charles Leclerc is able to handle himself now, less so. I know you can talk a couple of years ago where he hit the wall in France, for instance, but I think that was his turning point. That was his learning year, and that was his opportunity that kind of got squandered. And then we look at next year for Charles Leclerc up against Lewis Hamilton, though. It's going to be a very, very interesting year for Leclerc, and a tough one. Tough one to really show your quality, especially if Lewis Hamilton does come back into form once again. Talked about him a little bit too long there. Carlos Sainz was the driver who finished in front of Charles Leclerc, and Carlos Sainz, I think, again, just showed Ferrari what they are going to be missing. If Lewis Hamilton doesn't hit the ground running, Ferrari are really going to regret this decision, aren't they? Because Carlos Sainz seems to just be getting better and better and better. And I do think that this last season, even with him knowing that he's leaving Ferrari at the end of the year, it's probably, again, been his best season at Ferrari and probably his best season in Formula One. And it's difficult for a driver to keep feeling like they're getting better, but Carlos Sainz does. Carlos Sainz does feel like he's just taking each year in his stride, learning from what he got wrong last year, and he's super just professional. And I think Williams, it felt like a really big coup when they got that deal done and it was announced. But in and amongst the craziness of the season, you kind of forget that that's happening. A little bit like Hamilton and Mercedes. I think we just kind of forgot a little bit that this is the final season with Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes, because we're looking at each individual race and going into it. You actually look at the season as a whole. You look at the drivers on the grid, and the fact that Williams managed to get Carlos Sainz, who I think has been probably one of the top 5 drivers on the grid this season. Such a big deal for Williams. And I think he'll be brilliant. I think he will be able to take that Williams car at least a level up. I'm not saying that he's going to win a race or anything inside of a Williams car, but I do think he will be the best of the rest midfield driver. If that Williams car is competitive, and that Williams car is close enough to the Haas's, the RBs, the Alpines, I think he will be in that kind of Fernando Alonso position almost that Aston Martin found himself in this year, where he's just at the top of those midfield drivers by a considerable distance. I really do rate Carlos Sainz highly. I'd love to know, actually, in the description or in the comments, just what do you think? Where can Carlos Sainz be next year? Obviously, it's so dependent on the Williams car. But say all of those cars are similar to one another. So you've got Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly, maybe even Nico Hülkenberg if the Stake Sauber car can kind of get in there. Yuki Tsunoda in the RB. Kind of who comes out on top of those drivers? It's going to be a real mix once again. The quality of the Formula One grid at the moment is just insane. And it seems weird to say, but I think we've got a lot of drivers hitting their stride just at the right time. We've got a lot of drivers coming into their best form that they've ever been in over the next couple of seasons. And 2025, 2026 look to be electric. Just so exciting to see, especially if the 5 rookies that are coming in hit the ground running as well. Could be insane. Let's move on to Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton's final race for Mercedes. And as I say, it kind of snuck up on us a little bit. I think it snuck up on him a little bit too. He was talking about the fact that he had kind of been going race by race, knowing that it was coming to an end without really appreciating it. And hence why we got a little bit of the outbursts and some not too favourable words from Lewis Hamilton about that Mercedes car, him talking about it being the worst Mercedes car that he's ever driven, him sort of talking about not wanting to come and race at the final couple of Grand Prix. Was it after Vegas? Or was it? No, it was after Brazil, wasn't it? Where he kind of threatened to not take part in the last 3 Grand Prix of the year. And that kind of died away. And then it came back again after Qatar, and we didn't know if we were going to see him in Abu Dhabi. I think we always were. I think he always wanted to try and end on a little bit of a high. Obviously, an excellent fight back through the field. The whole weekend, he did feel like the stronger Mercedes driver, which is not something that we can say for a lot of the weekends this year. I do think George Russell has put in a really good fight over the course of the 24 races this season. But it did feel like this weekend was Lewis Hamilton's weekend. And even a Bollard ruining his qualifying, which was just so strange, wasn't it? Kevin Magnussen hitting that Bollard on the inside of the hotel section. sending it underneath Lewis Hamilton's car, it then getting caught on the floor of Lewis Hamilton's car for the final couple of corners. You could see on his Delta that he was up. Then he did the final couple of corners with a bollard under the car and suddenly lost a couple of temps. And it was like, well, yeah, okay. It was a little bit disappointing to see him exit in Q1, but there was nothing that he could do about it. But as I say, then when it came to the race, it was very clear that Lewis Hamilton had what he needed in the tank and was wanting to show Mercedes just what he does have and the quality that he does still possess. There was a time this season where we were questioning it. There was a time this season where we were saying Ferrari made a little bit of a mistake here. And I think there's still going to be those critics, especially if those first few races for Ferrari don't go too well. Abu Dhabi just shows that Lewis Hamilton does have the pace there when he's in the right position, when he feels comfortable in the car. I know that he got the better strategy as well, starting on the hards and going on to the mediums. But those 34 laps on the hards, he made sure that he kept hold of them. And then when he was on those fresher tyres, and Bono gives him that final hammer time as well, which was so lovely to see. And he just sived his way through the field. Like it was insane the lap times that he was putting in comparison to the rest of the field. He was a second quicker than George Russell on every single lap for the final few laps. Caught up to him right at the end, got that overtake done. George didn't put up too much of a fight. And I think if you're George Russell, you don't put up too much of a fight there because it's, imagine, you're trying to displace Lewis Hamilton as the Mercedes man moving forwards. There's still a lot of talk about, obviously, Kimi Antonelli coming in as a rookie next to you, but also Max Verstappen being linked with Mercedes throughout the season and him not really enjoying his time at Red Bull, even though he won the Drivers' Championship. Then you'd think, if George Russell would have just tapped Lewis Hamilton, sent him into a wall or something, it could have really gone wrong. It could have really, really gone wrong. But George kind of didn't put up too much of a fight, realised that Lewis Hamilton had the pace and was just like, you know what, Lewis? Take the extra couple of points. This one time, we're not going to bump wheels, as we've seen them do multiple times in their time together. But just letting Lewis Hamilton pass to an extent. I don't think George Russell ever say that he did, but he didn't. Yeah, it wasn't the most ridiculous defensive maneuvers from George Russell. As I say, I think he just wanted to make sure that Lewis Hamilton finished the Grand Prix because George Russell is a Lewis Hamilton fan as well, even though he is now competing with him. Overall, this was probably Lewis Hamilton's best weekend of the year in terms of his own performance. A nice way to sign up with Mercedes. And as I've kind of been saying over the last couple of race weekends, just now that we can look back at it, now that we can actually assess Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes, the decade or so that he spent with the team, the numerous championships, the numerous championship battles, the way that he has conducted himself throughout that time at Mercedes, the ridiculous amount of Grand Prix that he's been able to win, the ridiculous amount of pole positions that he has, the fact that he's been on the podium more so than anything else, like, it is just a sublime history that they have together. And again, I know right now he's going to want to go to Ferrari and try and win a championship with Ferrari and be the driver that can not only break Michael Schumacher's record, but also bring a championship to Ferrari for the first time since Kimi Räikkönen. And there's so many storylines, obviously, right there. But in 5-6 years' time, when I think Lewis Hamilton will have fully retired and maybe had a year or so outside of the sport to fully reflect that time at Mercedes, obviously the most time that he spent with a team, but also just the insane achievements that they managed to have. So much respect to them, so much respect to Lewis Hamilton, Toto Wolff, and everyone behind that team, because there are thousands of people all pulling in the same direction to make sure that that was the case. And I think it goes down as a dynasty. And, you look at Red Bull and the fact that Red Bull have won championships since 2022 and Verstappen's gone 4 times back to back to back. Mercedes, their era of dominance was so much longer than that. And it's so, Red Bull have shown that it's so hard to do. Mercedes managed to do it for so long. And with a few different drivers in there, obviously Nico Rosberg in there to begin with, alongside Lewis Hamilton. Then Valtteri Bottas comes in. They managed to do it so long and so consistently. It's just insane. And yes, 2023 Max Verstappen is the most dominant season that we have ever seen. Won every single race effectively, apart from one. Red Bull, didn't they? Max Verstappen winning over 20 races or whatever it was. What was it? 19, 20 races. It disappears out of my mind now. But the fact that Max Verstappen was so dominant that season, yep, fair enough. Most dominant season, broke all the records. But the fact that Mercedes did it for so long, just to me, absolutely boggles the mind. Talking about Red Bull, I haven't really got too much notes on them, to be honest. Like, their season was kind of over coming into Abu Dhabi, wasn't it? Max Verstappen had sealed the Drivers' Championship. They knew there was absolutely no hope of the Constructors' Championship over the last few races. But 2 crashes on the first lap probably wasn't how Red Bull wanted to finish what's been a very, very tough year for them, both on and off track. Like, you've got to remember, it did start with the whole Christian Horner saga at the beginning of the year, and it hasn't really gotten any easier from that. There's been discussions around Sergio Perez's seat continually throughout the entire year, Max Verstappen being in and out, and the fact that Max Verstappen's come under criticism for various different things throughout the year as well. Both his conduct off the track and on the track have come into question a good few times. It really hasn't been Red Bull's season, and the fact that then, Max Verstappen smashes into Oscar Piastri is certainly at fault for that on the first lap. Not a great way. Spinning is obviously in the wrong direction. Really nice pirouettes from Max Verstappen to be able to continue on. Like, Oscar Piastri obviously dropped right to the back of the pack, whereas Max Verstappen still managed to keep himself in and amongst the midfield drivers, which was pretty mental. Until he obviously picked up that 10-second penalty, which he did deserve. It was his fault. And then Sergio Perez being taken out by Valtteri Bottas. That wasn't Sergio's fault. Like, we've talked a lot about Sergio Perez, and I've been very, very negative about Sergio Perez for multiple different things this season, and I think it's been justified for the most part. But this DNF was not Sergio Perez's fault. Valtteri Bottas clashing with him. Bottas was penalised. It was just one of those things where it was like, how could this season get worse for Sergio Perez? And it was like, how about he has a pretty mediocre qualifying session and then is taken out by a Steak Sauber? It's like, okay, yeah, that's pretty much as bad as it could probably end for Sergio Perez. Whether this will be his final race inside of Red Bull, we're yet to find out. The discussions will happen between him and the Red Bull team. He's kind of staunchly said that he will be there for 2025 and 2026. He's talked a lot about the fact that he's got a contract, and that contract is signed and he's going to be staying. But for the first time, I can't remember if it was post-qualifying or I think it was post-Grand Prix, actually, where he kind of just let the mask slip a little bit. He just sort of said, oh, well, we're going to discuss it. Like, we'll go into the postseason and we will discuss the future and what it holds. He still kind of said, I've got a contract, etc., etc. But he did just let it slide a touch where it was like, oh, okay, so there is some discussions to be had. And that there are some discussions to be had, and that there's a lot of pressure on you. Obviously, he can't hide away from it. He knows that the pressure is on him. Max Verstappen kind of came out and defended him a little bit. But I do think Red Bull, if you're looking at this season, what more can Yuki Tsunoda do to warrant that seat, in my opinion? Even though Yuki Tsunoda won't probably end up in that seat. And the talk has always been Daniel Ricciardo. And then after Daniel Ricciardo left, the talk was Liam Lawson. And Yuki Tsunoda seems to just be completely washed over whenever it comes to that second Red Bull seat. But in terms of Yuki Tsunoda, I don't know what more he can do. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to RB, because we'll discuss both of them two together. But Sergio Perez, the team can't expect it to get better, because it's just getting worse season upon season. Okay, there's fluctuations in it. In the first 6 races of this year, he was doing perfectly. Then they kind of gave him the contract, hoping that it would spur him on a little bit. Did the opposite. If anything, it just made him worse and worse, and he progressively got pretty much nothing out of this season. Like, you look at his point scoring since the summer break, and it's comparable to Hülkenberg and Gasly, more so than any of the other top drivers in the top teams. That's where it's like, really, whoa. And I know, talking of that, Pierre Gasly got a little bit lucky in terms of the fact that he managed to get those points in such a sort of ridiculous fashion, a good chunk of them coming in that Brazil race. But again, 5th place finishes, 7th place finishes, just being able to continually do that. I did forget Esteban Ocon, before we delve into Pierre Gasly in this race, the whole Esteban Ocon situation, I did think it was strange. I can understand why Esteban Ocon decided to forego this final race with the Alpine team and let Jack Doohan take his place. I can also understand why Alpine do want Jack Doohan to have a Grand Prix run underneath his belt. Was it the most exciting Grand Prix run? Absolutely not. But he will have learned quite a lot inside of that. I do just think, though, it's a little bit disrespectful for me to drop Esteban Ocon with one race of the season to go, or to say that Esteban Ocon has to choose between finishing his Alpine career sort of in the correct way and then taking the running for Haas in the postseason tyre test. And the fact that Alpine kind of gave him that ultimatum, I don't like. I don't like that. But then what have we liked about the behind the scenes of Alpine in the last 5-6 years? Not a lot of it, to be honest. I'm hoping this might be a turning point. Oliver Oak seems like a lovely guy from the few races that we've had with him post-summer break. Does he seem as crazy as all of the other team principals? Probably not. Will his fate be the same as all of the other team principals if he doesn't quite get it right at the beginning of next season? Probably. You know, Bruno Firmin, we thought he was going to last for quite a long time. Didn't. Otmar came from Aston Martin, was very successful. Didn't. Like, you go all the way back to Cyril, just was doing a fairly decent job by all things. Like, Renault were progressing. Daniel Ricciardo then left, and it was like, okay, we're kind of falling apart here. But I do think that was a little bit unjust and unfair to make Esteban Ocon sort of have that decision. Did he make the right decision? We'll kind of see when he gets into the Haas car next year. I think he made the right decision exiting the team. I think he'd done everything that he possibly could with Alpine. He's won races. He's got podiums. Well, he's won a race, not one race, but won a race in Hungary. Got podiums for that team. Taking it as far as I think he could, especially as Pierre Gasly was slowly kind of replacing him as the star child in the team. In fact, Esteban Ocon's never really been the star child in the team, has he? Because even when it was Fernando Alonso, everybody liked Alonso a lot more. Even when he was alongside like Sergio Perez at Racing Point, everybody preferred Perez. Esteban Ocon, maybe this is his time to shine, right? He's going to finally be the number one driver in a team, the clear number one driver in a team, until Ollie Behrman is absolutely rapid or something. And then we're like, oh no, Esteban, really sorry, mate. You're going to have to be the number 2 to this rookie. But having said that, Pierre Gasly, to move back to him and to move back to Abu Dhabi, a lot of tangents in this post-race Grand Prix, mainly because I'm recording it very late after the Grand Prix itself, but also because end of the season we'll veer left and right as we go through it. But the fact that Pierre Gasly has been able to do that, like the fact that they were able to leapfrog, I thought they might be able to get in front of Williams. The fact that they were then also able to get in front of RB and Haas and actually come into this race most likely to finish in 6th place in the Constructors' Championship by a considerable mark. Like, they came in to this race with a 5-point lead. And a 5-point lead is big when it comes to those point-scoring places. When you're effectively hoping for 7th place being your best possible finish, that is very, very good. Because you're assuming that is the top 8 pretty much guaranteed, outside of maybe one or two of them colliding, or maybe it going wrong. So like Oscar Piastri obviously dropped out, and Sergio Perez dropped out because they got taken out at various points in the race. Otherwise, Piastri would have been up there. Perez maybe would have been up there by the end of it, just because of the general race pace of that Red Bull car. So you're looking at most of the time finishing 9th is the best of the rest place, isn't it? But Pierre Gasly has kind of put that to bed. He's been so good at the end of this season. Yes, they owe a lot to Brazil, but still insane. Like, superb. How he was able to do what he did in that car for the final 4 or 5 races of the season, I think has to be applauded. I think he was only, I'm just looking at the qualifying times here. Yeah, he was 3.5 temps off in qualifying. Just crazy. Put in a really good defensive performance in front of George Russell as well, which I think has to be highlighted. The fact he was able to keep a Mercedes behind for a good chunk of the race and really caused George Russell a headache. George Russell was not very happy at all to be stuck behind that bubblegum pink rear wing. And then when he caught back up to Pierre Gasly again after the pit stops, I was really worried if he was going to get stuck behind Pierre Gasly again, because he was so annoyed that he was stuck behind Pierre. But ultimately, the pace wasn't good enough, and he did drop back behind the McLarens, behind the Ferraris, and the Mercedes cars, and the Red Bull of Max Verstappen. So just kind of disappeared into the middle of the pack. But again, kept Nico Hülkenberg at bay quite handily. We thought at one point, oh, Nico Hülkenberg, maybe he'll be able to close the gap to Pierre Gasly. Maybe there'll be a proper battle here for 6th place in the constructor standings. Maybe it'll matter who finishes where. No, Gasly, cool, calm, collected, finished where he needed to, and absolutely just brilliant. I think, again, if you look at it over the course of the entire season, can we say that Alpine were the 6th fastest car? Absolutely not. Can we say that Pierre Gasly was the 10th fastest driver? Also probably not. But they did it where it counted, and they got the points where they needed to. And that just shows, especially towards that back end of the pack, where, as I said, the points are so difficult to come across. If you can just turn 1 or 2 Grand Prix in your favor, you can completely change the complexion of your entire season. In terms of Pierre Gasly, again, it's really hard to say. I was going to say that this was maybe his best season in Formula One, but I think that is recency bias. But then the car was so bad at the beginning of the year, we don't really know what Pierre Gasly's pace was like. It's close to 2021 for me. I think 2021 was Pierre Gasly's best season in Formula One. Just the pace that he had inside of that AlphaTauri car, the fact that he was qualifying inside of the top 10 really consistently in 2021, and made himself one of the drivers to really want to build a team around. And that's what Alpine saw, right? And they then decided to take Pierre Gasly on, and they're slightly reshuffling the team and eventually getting rid of Esteban Ocon so that Pierre Gasly can be the spearhead, I think, now for that Alpine team for the foreseeable future. 2021 for me was the season where I realized Pierre Gasly could be that for a team. And now it's all coming together, that another couple of years of experience, did it when he needed to, and put in the performances as soon as the car was there for him. I think that's the thing. As soon as the car was there, he started to deliver the performances that Alpine needed, and he started to put in the performances that were the best of the rest, right? Nico Hülkenberg, as I say, probably the best driver of those midfield cars throughout the season. Pierre Gasly shone when he needed to, got those points, and was absolutely sublime, like dragging the team to a 6th place in the constructor standings, despite finishing behind Esteban Ocon in Brazil. Again, that kind of goes under the radar, because a lot of people talk about it as like a 2-3 for Alpine. Esteban Ocon finished ahead of Pierre Gasly. Don't forget that. And I don't think Esteban Ocon will ever let you forget that either. For Haas, on the flip side of that, I think frustrating for them. 7th place in the constructor standings. I think they really wanted that 6th, didn't they? Especially because everybody coming into this year thought they were going to be 10th. We thought they were going to be the steak sour team, didn't we? We thought they were going to be the team that really struggled, didn't score many points, maybe didn't score a point at all. Actually, were really, really quick. They had their ups and downs, don't get me wrong. Kevin Magnussen in particular had a very tough final season in Formula One. A lot of incidents. Obviously, the first driver ever to get a ban because of the 12 penalty points on his license. And the fact that they got it, at least to the last race of the season, it was a possibility that they could come 6th in the constructor standings. I think they can be proud of. Nico Hülkenberg dropping 3 places on the grid. Again, overtaken in the pit exit. It was so frustrating to see, wasn't it? It was like, oh my God, Nico Hülkenberg's qualified in 4th place. This could really be on. As soon as that penalty came through, and as soon as he dropped behind Pierre Gasly on the grid, it was done for me. I wanted to believe, I wanted to hope going into it, because since they'd slapped those Toyota stickers on in Austin, and that Austin Grand Prix weekend, they were sublime. And then from then onwards, they've been really, really quick, actually, the Haas team. Beyond that, obviously, throughout the entire season, they've been very, very good. I think that step up that they took in Austin was the thing that made me feel like 6th place in the constructor standings was right there for them, and that battle was going to be between them and RB. obviously, as soon as I say, as soon as Haas or as soon as Hulkenberg got that free place penalty, it was going to be so hard to get past Pierre Gasly. It was just never really going to happen, was it? And unfortunate for them. A big year for them, though. A really big year for. It's weird. It's weird for Haas. Just kind of consolidating my thoughts on them. I haven't made too many notes on them, actually. But the fact that Nico Hulkenberg had such a good year and showed the potential that that car has. The fact that Kevin Magnussen had such an up and down year, but then at the end of the season kind of came to life a little bit, knowing that he definitely wasn't getting that seat for 2025, I think actually released him a little bit, took the pressure off, and just meant that he could drive with a little bit of freedom at the end of the season, did Kevin Magnussen. So I was really impressed with that from him. Neither of those drivers being there next season just puts them in a little bit of a weird spot where we can't quite 100% sort of say they'll be better or they'll be worse. And also we can't quite judge where they are. I think that's the thing. When a team swaps both drivers, it's really hard to judge, have the two drivers come in and they're just absolutely way better than Hulkenberg or Magnussen, or is the car way better? And it's going to be tough to really judge that. And we'll have to kind of wait and see where they slot in compared to the rest of the grid. So it's going to be a little bit weird. There's two ways of looking at it in terms of this season, though. Either you look at the fact that they finished 7th in the constructor standings, the fact they managed to beat out a team like RB, a team like Williams, who, coming into this season, everybody would have put way above Haas in terms of their possibility of finishing higher in the constructor standings. Or you look at it as slightly disappointing because they finished behind Alpine. I think they have to take the positives. I think they have to see this as a huge step forward for the team. They've got that Toyota deal now. They're moving in the right direction. They've got a brand new team set up coming next year. 2026, maybe. I know everybody's saying it, but 2026, maybe it can just be that time for Haas, because they did manage to get the 2022 regulations pretty good off the bat. They just struggled to adapt to it, didn't they? Kevin Magnussen came back in 2022, scored points straight away. They struggled to make the car better progressively, and their upgrades a lot of the time felt like downgrades, and they really struggled to improve a car throughout a season, is the words I'm looking for. This year, they didn't have that for the first time. Next year, I'm hoping that isn't the case either. We're going to see Haas maybe get back to like a 5th place in the constructor standings. They've been there before. Maybe they can do it once more. RB, I could talk about their finishing positions and how they did, but Lawson, it was a bit of a weird one. Had a pit stop issue where he was released without that front left wheel even being attached to the car. That then led to him getting a penalty and having to do another pit stop and just ground to a halt any kind of competitive race that he was going to have. He did say afterwards, though, his pace was really, really good. And I think he did slowly get better and better inside of that RB car. I know that Austin was the point scoring, but I think actually, generally speaking, and I agree with him, I think Abu Dhabi maybe was his best race inside of an RB car in the 6 races that he had. But as I say, that wheel not going on correctly, we didn't really get to see where he would fit in. And then Yuki Tsunoda had a really poor start, kept getting anti-stall, ended up in 12th place on 1 lap down, like lamenting the team's decision to leave him out without pitting early in the race. And that was maybe the most like exasperated radio message I've ever heard from any driver. It was the fact like, Yuki, we need to keep going, don't box, we need to keep going on this tire. And Yuki Tsunoda literally just like, why? Why? What have I done to deserve this? It's just like, okay, Yuki, yeah, we got it. You're not having a fun time. But as I say, both of those drivers had their races destroyed by things that were completely outside of their control. The wheel going on is not Liam Lawson's fault. The car being in the wrong settings and going into anti-stall on the launch is not Yuki Tsunoda's fault. So even though RB technically were in the fight for 6th in the constructor standings, they never felt like they were properly in that fight for 6th in the constructor standings. Like, being beaten out by Haas and Alpine seemed inevitable by the time we got to Abu Dhabi, even by the time we got to Qatar, really. And as I say, both drivers, we didn't really get to see anything. So it was their last opportunity to be like, I need to be the driver to replace Sergio Perez. And neither of them really got to shine in any way because of things that were outside of their realm. So just going to be looking at their 6 races next to one another. Obviously looking at Tsunoda's races next to Ricciardo and also next to Nick de Vries, trying to stack those up. I think it's going to be so difficult for Red Bull to judge this fairly. Obviously, they've got a lot more data than we have, but if you look at the 11 races, like put Daniel Ricciardo aside, yes, we can talk about Tsunoda's performances in there. In the 11 races that Tsunoda and Lawson have been next to each other, the first 5, obviously in 2023 when Daniel Ricciardo got injured, Tsunoda had his worst portion of the season where he had a load of mechanical failures and a couple of DNFs that were completely outside of his role. So then you've got that. Then when it comes to this time around and the 6 races that have had side by side, there really have been peaks and troughs for both drivers. Like you look at Mexico and the fact that Yuki Tsunoda kind of ruined that qualifying for them in probably what was their best chance at being super competitive in a race weekend. That will go really negatively for him. But then he did out-qualify Liam Lawson in all 6 of the Grand Prix. And his general race pace was better than Liam Lawson's over the course of the 6 Grand Prix. So there's like things that have gone to and against both of them. Liam Lawson being a little bit more competitive with Sergio Perez than maybe the Red Bull team would have wanted. Might go in his favour, might not. Depends what kind of mood Christian Horner and Helmut Marko are in on the day and whether or not they are sort of amused that Liam Lawson sort of bumped into Sergio Perez a couple of times, or if they're not very happy about the fact that he bumped into Sergio Perez a couple of times, but definitely made that 6 races count, didn't he, Liam Lawson? Made himself known by the Formula One grid, even if that was just by getting into arguments with quite experienced drivers in the form of Sergio Perez and Fernando Alonso. But RB, overall their season, a bit meh. Bit in the middle, you know. It wasn't amazing. I was hoping that Tsunoda would be more in that battle for 10th place in the driver standings, but got left for dead by Nico Hülkenberg in the end, and then Pierre Gasly just kind of sneaked through right at the final sprint as well. And then on the flip side of that, did we learn much from the time with Daniel Ricciardo, the time with Liam Lawson in the car? Really difficult to say. Williams, in terms of their season, again, kind of a bit of a weird one to judge overall for the 24 races. Started horrendously, had a little bit of a weird middle, looked really good post-summer break, absolutely atrocious at the end. Like, really went through all of the waves that it could possibly go for. And I think that the Williams team will just be incredibly thankful that this season is over. I think the roller coaster that they've had, like roller coaster is an understatement going through that. And I know that I've just snipped their season into 4 portions. You could take every single race individually and there would be ups and downs every single weekend. They've had by far and away the most stressful season of Formula One I think a team could ever have had. And it is just insane to me how hard they have had to work. How many Williams cars they've had to make this season. You know, actually, we didn't mention with Pierre Gasly the fact that he's the first driver ever to cause $0 worth of damage over the entire season, and a long season of that, 24 races. That has to be applauded. Williams could have done with that. Williams could have done with a driver that was maybe a little bit less crash happy, because as much as we can say Logan Sargent crashed the car a lot, Franco Colapinto also had his crashes towards the end of the season, Alex Albon wasn't the cleanest of drivers throughout the year either. Got to remember Australia, where they had the whole, oh my God, have we even got a car? Well, we're just going to have to race with one. That was Alex Albon's fault in Australia. He then got into a little bit of a tangle with Daniel Ricciardo. Can you blame him or Ricciardo? Bit 50-50, to be honest, in Japan. Probably more so Daniel Ricciardo's fault. But Alex Albon had his fair share of crashes over the course of the season as well. So it didn't matter who they put in those seats. It was pretty dire. And I think that's why they're looking at Carlos Sainz as this shining beacon of hope. Just please, Carlos, do not crash the car. Generally speaking, Carlos is pretty good at keeping out of the wall. But looking at their season, Franco Colapinto coming in was a real ray of sunshine, a real breath of fresh air into the team, exactly what they needed at that time. It went a little bit sour. Franco Colapinto had, I'd say, 5 races that were really, really good, followed by 4 races that were pretty poor. And then it's kind of like, okay, he did slightly better and then slightly worse. Whether that was the pressure, whether that was the changes in tracks, whether that was just things not quite going his way. Obviously, Brazil, I think, would have been a real dagger to the heart for Franco Colapinto, being that it was in Brazil. A lot of Argentine fans had come to see him, then crashing in qualifying, crashing again in the race. I think then having to do 3 more races, still incredibly young, still incredibly raw, backing that up with another crash in Vegas. I imagine Qatar and Abu Dhabi, he was being quite cautious. Even if he didn't mean to be, just like subconsciously, you would be like, right, I cannot crash this car again. Even if I'm slow, I cannot crash this car again. And I think that's why we ended up seeing Franco Colapinto maybe not getting an amazing finish in Abu Dhabi. Also, the fact he got rear-ended by Oscar Piastri that we talked about at the beginning. Then Alex Albon, the unorthodox strategy that they tried to go for at Williams. They almost did an RB. They tried to be like the different one in terms of strategy. Came up short. Didn't quite get inside of the points. Looked like it was on for a moment. Alex Albon even said himself after the race, like, felt like points were on. And then it got to sort of, okay, we've done 25, 26 laps on these hard tyres, and there's still 10 or 15 laps left to go. And then it all kind of fell away from him quite a lot. As I say, for Williams, all about next year, all about really getting some rest over the winter break, really, really getting some rest, and then coming at it for next year. Carlos Sainz in the car, completely new team dynamic. Anything can happen, really. I don't want to try and predict right now. I'll delve into it a little bit more as we get into the season. Will Williams finish 9th again in the constructor standings? They certainly could. Could they finish 6th? Yeah, I think so. I think that real midfield pack is going to be super, super close next year. Let's move over to Stake Sauber, who we don't normally talk about too much because there's not normally that much to talk about. Zhou Guanyu, let's get him out of the way first, actually. Zhou Guanyu, another solid performance from him, like a middling performance. Very Zhou Guanyu, got the job done. Very, like, understated manner. Good race. Did some donuts after the race as well. Lovely to see that. Hopefully we will see more of Zhou in Formula 1. In a full-time race seat, I'm not too excited to see him back in a full-time race seat. I think he's a perfectly capable midfield driver. I don't think we need a grid of totally capable midfield drivers. But maybe we'll see. Maybe he goes into like Cadillac for the first couple of years. I don't think he's a bad driver to put in if you just need a safe pair of hands for a few seasons. You know what I mean? But he's not, I don't think Zhou is the driver to build a team around for the future. I don't think he's like, yeah, we get in Zhou Guanyu and he's our driver to then launch us into that next stratosphere. He's the driver you get in when you just want to stay where you are and make sure that you get the performances in. But as I say, understated, but good from Zhou Guanyu. Valtteri Bottas. Normally, I would praise Valtteri Bottas. Generally speaking, I think Valtteri Bottas has had a good year. I think he's had a really tough time because of the Stake Sauber car not being great. That's not his fault. I think generally speaking, he's really, really composed, does very well. Of course, he's had a few incidents here and there throughout his career, but he's had a very long career in Formula 1, and who hasn't? This was Valtteri Bottas supercharged and completely lost the plot. I don't know what Valtteri Bottas was thinking. He was going for moves left, right, and centre, and not making any of them stick. Not one. Not one singular move did he make stick. Hitting into Sergio Perez on the first lap, getting that penalty. He deserved that penalty. He completely wiped out the rear end of Sergio Perez's car. Just went so deep into turn 6, especially on lap 1 when it's very congested in that part of the track. Absolutely mental from Valtteri Bottas. Super, super clumsy. And then even clumsier, you could argue, braking really heavy and really late into turn 6 later on. Not even nearly making the corner and just wiping out Kevin Magnussen. was also just insane. And just one of those things that you don't really see. You don't see that big a collision that often in Formula One in such a it was non-competitive, really. Both of them had nothing really left to race for. Bottas has already broken his front wing and had things go wrong for him. Kevin Magnussen was already in a position where the strategy had gone wrong for him. He'd also not had a great race. It was kind of over. And then they just decided to collide with one another. Obviously, Valtteri Bottas very much at fault for that again. Super clumsy. If the first one was clumsy, that was even clumsier. The most clumsy of them. And that then broke his front right steering arm and means that he had to retire from the race. And it was a shame because, as I say, 10 race wins, Valtteri Bottas. Super experienced driver on the Formula One grid. Usually a proper, good, safe pair of hands. Now also, a little bit of a weird one here. The fact that Valtteri Bottas now has that penalty looming over his head, the fact that he couldn't obviously serve the penalty in the race because they had to retire the car, does mean that he has, I think it's a 5-place grid penalty on top of his head for the foreseeable future. So if you do want to get Valtteri Bottas in as a reserve driver, which is what Mercedes have been talking about possibly getting in, him alongside Kimi Antonelli as a little bit of a senior figure that can help him out in his first season. I think that's a great idea, by the way. But it does mean if Kimi Antonelli is ill or misses a race, like he did in Qatar, missed the final like he did in Abu Dhabi, missed the final Formula 2 race of the season, and you do have to put Valtteri Bottas in, Valtteri Bottas then also has a 5-place grid penalty that he has to deal with. So a bit of a weird one for Valtteri. As I say, went out with a bang. Wanted to be remembered, did Valtteri Bottas. And we're going to remember him for lots and lots of different things, from being one of the most consistent, being part of one of the most consistent and greatest Formula One eras that we've seen for a team in Mercedes, all the way up to, releasing a new calendar and smashing into Kevin Magnussen as his final action inside Formula One. He's really seen the spectrum as Valtteri Bottas across his career. I did think it was quite interesting that Valtteri came out and was really open and honest about the end to his Formula One career, and particularly choosing Sauber over the other teams that were in for him when he did decide, or when he was kind of put aside by the Mercedes team. He admitted that choosing Sauber was an error on his part. He said, "It was a mistake. You can't predict the future. Everything started well off in the first year. Since then was downhill." And he made a good couple of points. Obviously, he talked about the fact that Williams were the main other team that was in for his signature. Williams hadn't scored as many points as Stake Sauber over 3 or even 4 seasons, I think, before that. Got to remember, this was still a Williams car that had Nicholas Latifi involved in it, and a Williams team that looked absolutely atrocious, was basically just running around at the back of the grid for a good 4 or 5 years. It was not the Williams team that Valtteri Bottas left. Like, we remember Valtteri Bottas getting podium finishes inside of that Williams team when he was there. It was a very, very different look Williams team. And as he said, Stake Sauber or Alfa Romeo, as they were at the time, did seem like they were getting better. It did seem like they were moving in the right direction, and especially sort of getting rid of Kimi Räikkönen and Antonio Giovinazzi. It felt like they were going into a new era, and maybe there was something there. And Valtteri Bottas even talked about the fact that Fred Vasseur was a big, big turning point for them, and the fact that Fred was a big part in the decision that he made. Because he used to work with him before, there was a clear plan and a target for the 3 years that he had on his initial contract with the team, and how we would get there, how they would improve the team. And I think Fred being there, and then Fred obviously going over to Ferrari after that first season, Valtteri Bottas explains that all of those plans went in the bin. And when it came to the other team principals that have come in, and they've gone through a fair few actually, when it comes to that Stake Sauber / Audi / Sauber Alfa Romeo team. It's gone through a few guises over the last few seasons. Valtteri Bottas kind of made the good point that without Fred Vasseur, it just felt anchorless or rudderless. And yeah, you can't predict the future. And I think Valtteri Bottas, I was kind of trying to think about it. I was like, okay, so if instead of Alex Albon, so it would have likely been a Valtteri Bottas, Nicholas Latifi driver lineup for Williams. Then Nicholas Latifi, I assume would have still gone at some point, like probably in a similar position to where he was. And then maybe Alex Albon comes in. Valtteri Bottas and Alex Albon as a driver lineup is way better than Alex Albon and Nicholas Latifi, and also way better than Logan Sargent as well. So Valtteri Bottas maybe still would be in a seat. Would he now be displaced by Carlos Sainz? Maybe, I don't know. It's so tricky to say, isn't it? It's obviously that butterfly effect. We don't know whether Valtteri Bottas going to Williams would have completely changed the complexion of that Williams team for the foreseeable future, but would have been interesting to see. And as he says, would he have then still been a driver? Maybe, maybe not. I think it was then a little bit of a stab in the back, though, because he did have the opportunity to move teams this season. He could have started to have discussions with, all of the other teams. There was so many driver changes throughout this season. But he said that he didn't decide to do that because once Audi confirmed that they were joining, he was told that he would be a pillar for the project. And that didn't happen. So he was expecting to sign another deal with Stake Sauber for next season. We know that they had a contract already in place. It was never signed, but we know that they did put together a contract for Valtteri Bottas that then just kind of got swooped out from underneath his feet when they managed to get Gabriel Bortoleto. And again, that was probably because the management side of things at Audi, as they are taking over Stake Sauber, changed so much throughout the season. They left everybody a little bit confused, and Valtteri Bottas probably the most confused of anybody because he thought he had another couple of years, pretty much guaranteed, and then just got taken away from him. On that note, though, just outside of Formula One, to quickly say, Gabriel Bortoleto did manage to win the Formula 2 championship. Isaac Hadjar made it a little bit easy for him. If you haven't seen the finale of the Formula 2 season, a little bit of a spoiler, Isaac Hadjar does stall on the grid, which then puts him a lap down on everybody else. And Gabriel Bortoleto, I think he was going into the final race. Was it half a point that he had over Isaac Hadjar? So just had to finish in front of him. And when Hadjar's a lap down, and I think Bortoleto was leading, fairly chill, isn't it? It's a fairly easy way to win a championship. Just make sure that you finish inside of the points. Hadjar did his best. Like, he put in absolutely everything that he possibly could. But Bortoleto just does look like a little bit of a special driver. Obviously, going back-to-back Formula 3 and Formula 2 championships, both as rookies. Things that Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri, George Russell have done. And you start to put him in that conversation. You're like, oh, okay, will Bortoleto end up being, if he's anywhere near as good as George Russell, Oscar Piastri, and Charles Leclerc, we're going to see him at a big team sometime soon. He's going to be a linchpin driver for the foreseeable future, and we're going to see him maybe does end up going to McLaren. I've thought about that a little bit, whether if Lando Norris ever does decide to leave, or if Lando Norris moves to one team or another, is Bortoleto the man that goes into that McLaren car? Because they've got that connection. I know that they've cut ties officially in terms of him going over to Audi for 2025 and then into 2026. I do think just the McLaren team allowing him to do that, the McLaren team kind of giving him that opportunity to go, just keeps that positivity there. And I think Bortoleto is a really, really good driver. Does he replace someone like a Max Verstappen at Red Bull? Like, there's going to be some big seats, I think, that will open up over the next few years that Bortoleto will be at least in the discussion for. Obviously, there's a lot of other drivers coming onto the Formula One grid. There's Ollie Behrman going into Haas. You'd say that he's probably most likely to end up in a Ferrari seat if one becomes available. Lewis Hamilton isn't getting any younger. Maybe Charles Leclerc finally loses hope. I doubt that. I think Charles Leclerc might end up just being a one-team man. I know that he technically had a year with Alfa Romeo, but he was still a Ferrari driver whilst there. So can we count that as like a one-team man? Maybe not, I guess. Lando Norris may end up being a one-team man. Where does he go? George Russell, maybe, if Mercedes give up on him. Gabriel Bortoleto go in there. I just think there's an opportunity. Again, it's right place, right time, isn't it, with Formula One a lot. So maybe he'll be one of those drivers that just misses out on being in a top team, even though he's got good quality. But I could also see him being in a big team for the future. However, we're not here to talk about Formula 2. We have rounded out. It's very late here now. What is it? It's over 1 o'clock in the morning. So we're going to leave that there. That's Abu Dhabi. That's 2024, ladies and gentlemen. It's been great. I've had a really lovely time. All of the live streams, obviously starting this brand new project of the Turning Point. Towards the end of the season, it will be back in full force next year with these post-race reactions, but also lots and lots of content to come over the postseason and into the pre-season of 2025 as well. So make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. Make sure that you do follow this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, so that you can listen to the audio version as well. But I do want to say a big thank you to everybody who has been involved in the channel in any way, whether it is leaving just a singular view or leaving a singular like on one of the videos over the course of 2024, or whether you've been here for every single one, you've subscribed since the beginning, and you've been a wonderful, wonderful part of the channel. Like, thank you so, so much. Thank you for watching this. If you've managed to get all the way through, I know that it's been an absolute slog of a video. It's been a very, very long one, but I massively appreciate it. Thank you again, and I will see you very, very soon.